opinions of their employer.
Sorry, I had to start the recording. I didn't realize the show.
Yeah.
Hope everybody's okay with that.
So next up is Lisa Gay, who's our En-ROADS ambassador and also our research and design engineer. So Lisa, if you could give us some more details on yourself, please.
Yeah, so I've been with CCL for a couple of years now. I came to CCL because I've always been interested in the best way that I could reduce emissions, both myself and politically. And I actually went into chemical engineering with the idea that I would work on technological ways to reduce emissions, and then realized that wasn't enough, which is why I joined CCL in the first place. I really enjoy the En-ROADS model, which is a way to kind of think quantitatively about how different changes will affect, different policy changes might affect the climate. And so, yeah, I guess that's my plug for En-ROADS a little bit there. Thanks, Frank.
Okay, thank you, Lisa, appreciate it. And next up is Paul Thiers, who's an associate professor of political science at Washington State University. Go Cougs. So Paul, please give us some more details about yourself.
Yeah, whoops. I'm having some, can you hear me now?
Yes.
We can hear you,
Yeah, so I've been at Washington State University in Vancouver for 22 years. I teach comparative and US politics, comparative public policy, climate change and energy policy, and environmental policy.
Mm-hmm.
Very interested, have been for a long time, in how local governments interact with global forces, and how that changes both economies and the ecology at the local level. Most of my field work has been in rural China for about 3 decades. And I've been also working on the US Pacific Northwest. Most recently really interested in the thin green line idea and how some of these permitting processes for fossil fuel exports have been impacted by local government and local activists. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Well, thanks to all three of you for taking the time this morning to be with us. And we're really looking. Yep. Yes.
Would it be okay if I quickly introduce myself for the recording?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Rose Anderson, energy economist and CCL volunteer since 2014. I currently work as an economist for the Oregon Public Utility Commission, but my views expressed today don't reflect those of my employer. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you. And like I said, thanks to all three of you for joining us today. We're looking forward to hearing your perspectives on these topics. Maybe Sharon, if you could bring up the slide deck on the fee and dividends slide, the open discussion one. Yeah.
Can you see that? So we're just going to run down to this one.
No, let's start with the slide 2.
Slide 2.
Yeah, right. And then can you go to slide?
Oh, topics for discussion.
No, the slide view. You know where it's a presentation.
Oh,
view.
I'm sorry. It's been a while since I.
So slide 2, and then just go to your little. Yeah. Okay. Then the next one. There you go. Perfect. Whoop, one too far.
Oh, sorry.
There you go. So I just want to give everybody a little background on where this panel discussion came from. So, and it is an open discussion on the topics of fee and dividends. It sort of began with the discussion that Sharon and I had around dividends and questions about our dividends, universal dividends in particular. Is that the right approach to take? And is that going to have the desired impact on helping reduce emissions? And so we found a book, and maybe if you can go to the next slide, we can talk about the book for a second. So it's a book called The Case for Carbon Dividends by James K. Joyce. And so we read the book, which we recommend to everybody. It's a very easy read. It gives you some good input on the basics of why reduce carbon, first of all, in the first place, and why put a price on carbon emissions as CCL is proposing, and what is carbon rent, which is a topic they discuss in the book, and why a carbon dividend. And so, like I said, easy read, but it also led to some more questions, and in three in particular. So if you go to the next slide there, Sharon, these are the topics that we wanted to explore with our panelists this morning. So in terms of these various approaches, which ones have the biggest impact on lowering emissions? So there's there's three choices that were discussed in the book. There's either the cap and trade approach or a carbon tax, or otherwise known as a carbon price, is one of the topics, one of the choices of approaches. The second one is, if you choose price, do you base it based on the economic price, or some call it the social cost of carbon, or is it more based on a target emissions level, such as the Paris Agreement, Paris Accord? And then thirdly, the choice between what to do with the money. Is it universal dividends, or are there other options, which might include hybrid? As some people get money, some of the money goes into other programs or investment or whatever it might be. And so we want to hear our panelists' opinions on those various approaches. So we're going to take one at a time. So the first one will be the cap and trade versus the carbon tax and price approach. And so we're going to move to that one. And I'm going to be recording the pros and cons of each one of these, as well as we're recording this session, obviously. And then afterwards, we'll send out the slide deck as well. That'll have the input from our panelists included on there. So if we can, maybe we can just remove the slide deck and go and stop sharing. That way we can see people when they talk. And we're going to take about 15 minutes to focus in on the the cap and trade versus the carbon tax and price approach. And so I'm going to open it up with Rose to start that way. So Rose, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Frank. When I think about a carbon tax in comparison to a cap and trade system, the main benefit and the main pro, in my view, is the simplicity of the carbon fee. It can be implemented at a high level where the government only interacts with about 2,000 collection points. And that's the mine, the wellhead, or the point of import of fossil fuels. And that's a number from the Boyce book, which I really enjoyed reading. And it's a lot simpler than cap and trade, for example, where, in order for there to be a robust market for these permits, there need to be a lot of different compliance entities. Each kind of individual emitter, maybe it's a plant or a business, but there's just a lot more going on, and a lot more administrative overhead that can come with that. The administration of the revenue collection for a tax in the Boyce book was estimated to be about 0.25% of revenues collected.
Okay, so simplicity of the carbon tax and price versus the complexity, really, of keeping up with and administering the cap and trade process. Okay, thank you. So let's move on to Lisa then, see it and get to her take on these two approaches.
Hi, Frank, thanks. So one of the things about the carbon tax as well is that it allows for kind of a more predictable price that businesses know how to respond to, versus the cap and trade has kind of a more fluctuating price. So that would be one potential benefit. For example, in the bill that CCL advocates for, you have the steadily rising price. So this can mean like different projects that a company might want to implement, they know that the price isn't going to go down or up severely. They can plan for the price. They can plan these projects more readily. So that would be one potential benefit.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, any cons to either one of these that you see? So
Am I up? Yeah.
No, I was just asking Lisa if there were any
Oh,
cons or any pros to cap and trade or cons to either one of these that you saw.
yeah, I mean, so one potential pro to cap and trade that was discussed in the book was that it puts a hard limit on the total emissions, which a carbon price doesn't necessarily do. We don't know how, don't necessarily know how elastically the demand response will be to a price with the carbon price. So and I think we'll probably get into this later when we talk about how we want to set the price. So I guess I don't want to go too deep.
Don't want to jump the gun.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Okay, thank you. Okay, Paul, your turn, please.
Yeah, I wouldn't add too much to what's been said. I think it's nice and clear and concise. But I think one thing that's interesting to think about that's a pro for both of these is this idea of what we sometimes in policy studies call low-hanging fruit, meaning that everyone has an incentive to do, all polluters, let's say that way, have an incentive to do as much as they can to reduce emissions, even if they can do more than a sort of a blanket limit on emissions applied to everybody would entail. So if I can cheaply reduce my emissions beyond what the target is, I would do that, because now in cap and trade, now I can sell those emission reduction credits to somebody else.
Right.
And in the tax, obviously, you do as much as you can to not pay the tax.
Right.
So I think that that's a nice pro, because government doesn't have to know who can reduce emissions most. And the government not having to know things is a tremendous advantage. That leads to the con for cap and trade, which is that the government has to know if credits being sold, that is emission reductions, are actually taking place. And that can be a big problem. It can also be a political problem. I was just going to add on the Washington bill, which I think was Sharon was nice enough to send around to us, or maybe that was Marcia. The possibility of exceptions, what we call leakage, in the boundary and in the cap are really there. Just to use an example, in Washington State's bill, all agricultural activity would be exempt, both on farm as well as transportation. And aviation fuel, most aviation fuel, at least that's kerosene, is exempt. And biofuels are exempt, emissions from biofuels. So what that sort of shows you is what are the politically powerful sectors in the Washington state economy: agriculture, aviation, and most recently, there's been a real increase in the economic power of biofuel, well, in the last 2 decades. So we can see that breaking the cap and trade system, there's a strong incentive to encroach upon it, at least from politically powerful actors. And I think that's a little harder to do with the sales tax, although you can obviously argue with exemptions for a consumption tax like
Sure. But it's a little less, it's a little more transparent, it sounds like, maybe on the price side.
Yeah, we know what's taxed and what's not. And the argument why my product shouldn't be taxed, it has to be made on those terms.
Right.
Right.
Good. Okay, thank you. So Sharon, do we have a little time for questions on this topic from our attendees?
We do.
Okay.
We have only used about 7 minutes of our topic.
All right. So let's open up for questions then on the cap and trade versus carbon tax from our attendees to our panelists. Not everybody at once either.
So Karen raised her hand first.
Good.
If we use your little hand reaction thing, that'll put you in the queue at the top of my screen.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead, Karen.
Didn't know how formal. Maybe you're going to, maybe you'll address this in a little bit, but I think the pros and cons discussed here so far, which is very clear and it's nice and succinct, is a little bit more on the capabilities versus the acceptability. And I think there's some pros and cons just in terms of perceptions and reactions from legislators to these various approaches and whether you're going to get that later. You know, I guess my own sense is cap and trade has a really bad feeling or has a really bad, they're really bad impressions about cap and trade. And so there's sometimes not a willingness or acceptability for some of these things just because of history, myths, stories, and whether you give a little bit of lens on that or going to.
I'll open that up for our panelists, whoever would like to address that one.
I'll speak to it just on one issue. You know, ironically, cap and trade had a great reputation when it first came into the climate change conversation, which was with the Kyoto Protocol. And that was because the amendments to the Clean Air Act, which in the 1990s, which used cap and trade to address acid rain, sulfur dioxide emissions from coal-fired power plants in the Midwest, is seen as one of the great environmental policy successes of our time. I think what it shows is that when there's a limited number of polluters, very easily identified, reasonably easily monitored, and a set of solutions that some firms are going to be able to use and others not, so scrubbers and also soft coal versus hard coal, things like that, that cap and trade can be really, really powerful. The failure of the Kyoto Protocol, particularly around cap and trade, had to do with a lot of these leakage things. And I think that at least in the policy community, cap and trade has really lost stock. But in those limited, you know, for power plants and the Clean Power Plan that under the last year, the Obama administration included some trading options, and states were working on that. I think in circumstances like really big power emitters, limited number, fairly easy to monitor, cap and trade might be a really effective way. The other big pro that we didn't talk about is a company that might have to lay off all its workers under a regulatory ban can potentially stay open and keep employing people if they can buy credits from somebody else. So, you know, disruption to the economy, cap and trade shouldn't be ignored, but I'm not sure it's the right thing for, you know, an entire population of very diverse emissions.
Thank you. That's the best historical, helpful perspective I've heard. So thank you very much, Paul.
Thanks, Karen. Any other hands raised there?
Yes, we have Marcia.
I'm just wondering if you could give some perspective on California's cap and trade and if it is bumping up against some of these cons and just anything you can tell me, because I believe that's been in existence for quite some time now.
Okay, maybe either Rose or Lisa would like to weigh in on that one.
So I don't mind weighing in with my very cursory knowledge of the California market.
Okay.
Say, I believe that price in that market has typically remained near the floor, which, you know, that's why the floor is there, to make sure that prices stay at a certain level. So to that extent, ensures a certain amount of effectiveness. But yeah, I think it would be perhaps more encouraging to see that the cap getting tighter and the price increasing as a result.
Good. Thanks.
So, Rose, while you're talking, I'm going to skip ahead of Claire just a smidge, is that I remember before COVID, I made a statement at a CCL meeting about the Oregon cap and trade legislation that didn't pass, and a whole bunch of Republicans ran off. And there was quite a bit of grieving. And what was it, 2019? Was it 2019? Anyway, I'm made a disparaging remark about cap and trade, and you told me that you had worked on that Oregon cap and trade bill, right? And that there were some good parts to it, and that I was wrong from an economics standpoint. Could you talk to that a little?
So Sharon, I do not remember that exact conversation, but I was aware of the cap and trade bill. I didn't work on it directly. I was aware of it, and I think that I wanted in our conversation, I remember that I wanted to share with you the ways that cap and trade can be pretty equivalent to a carbon fee, a carbon tax, in that they can accomplish the same goals. And there are these pros and cons that can make cap and trade more complicated, but it can work. And that was
Like
the
Paul
main,
was talking about.
yeah, right.
All right, Claire, you have a question?
Well, yes, and I sort of had two. First of all, Rose made a remark about cost, and I never really thought about the cost of the cap and trade. I was wondering if there was a comparison between the administrative cost of these two. And then also the thing about exceptions for cap and trade for agriculture and stuff. I believe the CCL bill also had exceptions for military and agriculture, if I'm not mistaken. So just wanted to see if there were comments about that.
We'll open that up for the panelists, whoever might want to weigh in on those.
So on the comparative cost of a cap and trade program, I don't have data on that, but theoretically, you'll need to be administrating that pretty actively. So there will be people working full time on that for sure. In terms of your other question, which was about exceptions?
Yes.
In the CCL policy proposal.
Oh, specifically, right? I'm not familiar with what the specific exceptions were in CCL's policy.
Yeah,
So-
I'm not familiar with the exceptions in the proposed bill either, and maybe Lisa does, but I'll just say, in terms of administrative costs, when we looked at both the clean development mechanism in China and the ETS, which is the European trading scheme in the European Union, both under the Kyoto Protocol, sometimes up to 30% of the value of the credits was going to verifying the credits. And whole industries emerge, lawyers and accountants who are, and everybody needs a job, but that does diminish the incentive. I don't really know about research of the administrative cost of, say, value added taxes or sales taxes, which would be, or excise taxes. It seems like it will be less because it's, as you know, it's harder to not pay sales taxes, which is what this would look like.
Okay, thanks, Paul.
All right, we're at our time for the next
Yeah.
topic, Frank.
Yeah, so let's move on to our next topic, which is the impact to emissions between the economic price, or otherwise sometimes known the social cost of carbon, versus a target emissions price set by an overall emissions target, such as the Paris Accord. So let's go in reverse order. We'll let Paul start us off on this one, please.
I've been talking a lot, so I don't want to take too much on this. I think social cost of carbon, calculating what are the sort of externalized costs of greenhouse gas emissions that the person purchasing a product doesn't pay, right? What's missing from the price. It's a really important concept. It's kind of classic market failure in classical economics to want to re-internalize those social costs at exactly the amount that you calculate them to be. The only thing I'd say is I think it's politically very problematic. And if your goal is to reduce emissions rather than to achieve perfect market symmetry, then I think that we need targets. I think when the UN system moved to first 2 degrees centigrade and then 1.5 degrees centigrade as these real targets, I think it had political power, and so I think targeting is a better strategy in terms of passing and maintaining policies.
Okay, thank you. Lisa, how about your perspective on this one?
Yeah, I think when we look at the just setting an economic price, one of the issues with it that the book discusses is that if we only set the economic price, then we're not meeting those goals. Actually, the book states that we would get to about 3.5 degrees of temperature rise by just setting the economic price. So it's not effective to getting to the target that we want, as Paul mentioned. And I think that really we don't want to just go off of the economic price, partly because, one of the things inherent in the economic price is something called the discount rate. So any kind of future gains are not as weighted as gains right now, which means that there's kind of more of a bias to emit now and not worry about the damage in the future. And so I think you do need these targets in order to set a price to meet the targets.
Good, okay. Any cons on the target price side from your point of view?
Well, one thing that the book mentions is not necessarily as straightforward as the economic price. And maybe Rose can talk more about that and her perspective. I don't want to cover everything either.
Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, that brings us to Rose then. So.
Thanks, Frank. So I want to echo, what my fellow panelists just said. An economic price, it is transparent and it's predictable for businesses. That could be a pro. But also it may not achieve the desired effect. It may only get you partway to the outcome you're looking for, and that's not really ideal in a policy. It may be difficult to overhaul a policy once it's in place. And the pros of a target price are that it can really be tailored to achieve your desired outcome in an efficient way. You're not going to overshoot, you're not going to undershoot. There may be a little bit of price variability if you design your policy so that the carbon price adjusts upward if more emissions reductions are needed. That may be somewhat unexpected to businesses, but I think there are a lot of steps you could take to mitigate any uncertainty there. And
Right. So you can kind of see the impact coming a little bit better.
hopefully, yeah.
Yeah. Even though not precisely, but at least close counts in that deal, I would think. So
I'd also imagine you could limit the percent change per year or take other steps.
Mm-hmm. Good. Okay. Great. Well, I suspect, Sharon, we have some time for questions.
We do.
Okay. Do you have some hands raised on those?
Any questions? Karen.
I don't know if this is within the purview, what you might be able to comment on, but do you have any general sense of like Republicans versus Democrats? Is there an alignment of like which is favored by different constituencies?
I'd have to go back and unravel the history of the arguments, but it's my memory that the Obama administration had a, well, I can't believe I'm old enough that I can't just pull this out of my head. Had a rule to calculate social cost, and that rule was challenged in court from the Republican side. Maybe somebody else has a better memory of this, but there's been legal battles over, sort of social cost, calculation of social impact. And I think that, I don't know if the politics of the target price are more sort of recognizable, slug it out politics of, can we raise this? Can we lower it? Our side wants to raise it. Our side wants to lower it. And so a more traditional political battle rather than the kind of almost culture war stuff that something like, what is socially just pulls the United States into or pulls the Congress into right now and paralyzes them.
That aligns with my sense and memory as well. I think the social cost of carbon is a lovely concept that it seems like a thing you could search forever and you will never get agreement on because of the complexities and because of the inherent nature of how you calculate such a thing. That it's a nice concept that could never be achieved, is my sense of it too from the Obama administration. So I just was curious if that's still kind of the current thinking, which seems to be what you're saying.
Well, I can try to, from the conservative point of view, it's my understanding that the Republican Party, and this is kind of weird because they're really anti-tax, but if we're going to have a tax, it needs to be explicit in law. They are kind of their political fight, and we could say whether or not it's polarization or just being contrary, is that they don't like experts running around and coming up with figures that are very variable and seem very subjective, and they like laws where similar to the Energy Innovation Act, which is this price is going to go up and it's in there and it gives teeth and very explicit things to the EPA and doesn't, and it's just very much more concrete.
Yeah, thanks, helpful, thank you.
So we
Any
can
other-
move on to the meat of the thing.
Okay,
If everybody's ready for dividends,
no
Let's
question,
do
no other
it.
questions on the price and our target. Okay, yeah, so next topic is the universal dividends as proposed by CCL and others and described in the book, or other options, which he actually mentions in the book. There have been some approaches where we're providing dividends to lower income categories of people and doing other things with money instead of handing it out to the upper income groups. And there may be other versions of those hybrid type of approaches out there. But anyway, let's go back to our alphabetical order and start again with Rose and get her perspective on the universal dividends versus other approaches.
Thanks, Frank. So it's interesting comparing universal dividends to other options, because I think there are a range of other options that could have similar pros or cons to universal dividends, depending on how they're implemented. But I would like to talk about some of the pros of universal dividends as I see them. And I think the biggest pro in my view is that it reduces any cost shock to individuals. Nobody's having their, for the most part, most people are not having their expenses increase greatly in a given year.
Mm-hmm.
Especially people in the lower income tiers are
Right.
Likely being compensated more than they're spending. So it's very good for individuals. And yeah, specifically for households at the lower 1/5 of the income spectrum, we saw in the book by Boyce that $100 per ton carbon price would, if implemented, it would increase their yearly costs by 6%. But once you implement universal dividends, it would actually increase their net income by almost 12%. So that's the power of the dividend.
You mentioned other, you could think about many different other options. Do you have any in mind in particular?
Right. So there are a lot of options with what to do with that income, that rent from the policy. And they can include, popular among conservatives are reducing certain types of taxes, especially for business. Popular among probably more liberals are like spending on research and development or direct assistance to low-income families. There could be a combination of those approaches. And maybe my fellow panelists can think of other ideas as well.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Okay, Lisa, you keep going second because you're in the middle alphabetically. So either way we go, you're second. So please go ahead.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest benefits to the universal dividend is that it makes it a lot more politically feasible and stable. So, we've seen that gas prices really affect people's political perception of what's happening. We've seen like rising gas prices, and that, people tend to have a more negative view of the administration with rising gas prices. And it seems to be really tied to that. So, one thing with the carbon tax, I think in the book it said that $80 a ton would be about additional 65 cents a gallon, but then you would get maybe another $700 a year per person from the revenue for the dividend. So I think having the revenue to offset those costs, as Rose said, does benefit the individuals, and that makes it more likely for people to want to keep that policy in place across the board. And I think basically one of the fears that people might have for implementing a carbon tax is that one of the things that people say, oh, it'll increase the costs to those individuals. So if you can show that in fact it might benefit, like 60% of the population that emits, not as much, and then maybe the top, the top 40%, like 20%, it's about equal, and then the top 20% emitters end up paying more, which creates an incentive to reduce those emissions. And I think basically it's just a way to also make it more popular. And one of the most important things, and the thing that CCL is trying to do, is make this thing passable in the first place. So the dividends is something to make it popular.
Good. Thank you. Paul.
Yeah, just to kind of real quickly follow on what Lisa was saying, because I think it's really significant when we look at the impact of $1 increase in the price of gasoline for the average American driver. We're talking about $400 a year per dollar increase in gas taxes. So in gas prices. So if you lay that out, the money clearly would benefit most drivers. And when Sharon began by asking us what we'd do with our dividend, I was thinking about this, and a lot of people, the answer needs to be, and they need to know it's okay for the answer to be, I'm going to pay for gasoline. That's what I'm going to do with my dividend. And that's what the dividend's for. If you cannot reduce your emissions, you can still live your life. And I think we really need to make it clear to people that is and maybe follow up by saying, I'm going to buy gasoline because I have to, and I'm going to celebrate the fact that climate change is being addressed. Right? I'm going to feel much better about that. The thing I really wanted to focus on a little bit in terms of not so much the benefits of dividends, which the other two covered very well, but to think about some of the lack of benefits of other things to do with the rent, with the money. When we say rent, we mean rent is about who gets money without having done anything specific to earn it, right? So the money collected in any kind of sin tax can be used for a bunch of different things. And from theory of sin taxes, it doesn't matter what you do with it. Government could throw it away. People didn't, the tax on tobacco reduced smoking, and it didn't reduce smoking because of anything that was done with the revenue collected from the cigarette taxes. The existence of the cigarette taxes is what reduced smoking. So in the same way, we have absolutely no obligation to use this money for anything that has anything to do with climate change. And that goes for government or for an individual receiving a dividend. If government keeps it, as was said, that a lot of the temptation on the left is often to use it to subsidize research or even to subsidize renewable energy directly. And I just want to make the point that those things might be great things to do, but this concept of somehow replacing fossil fuels with renewable energy has really been oversold, in my opinion. Partly because it's politically easier to make that case, but it just doesn't work. The story of the 20th century is the replacement of coal with oil, right? Oil eclipsed coal as our fuel, but coal use went up throughout the entire 20th century. So how do we justify those two things? Well, we use a lot more energy than we used to. Right. And we will use much, much more energy. So when we increase the use of renewables, the percentage of our energy use coming from renewables goes up, and often the amount of energy we get from fossil fuels also goes up at the same time. And so I think a case can be made to subsidize renewables, but the case should not be the reduction of emissions. The reduction of emissions comes from changes in behavior. And so the taxing incentivizes changes in behavior. and the dividend allows people who cannot change their behavior to continue to live their lives. So I think that's all I really wanted to say. Sorry to go on for so long with it.
No, I think that's a good point.
Go ahead, Sharon. I'm typing.
You're typing. Okay, so
typing,
this is our question and answer period. Anyone have any questions about alternatives? I know that one of the things that is a challenge, even within CCL, is that a lot of our members of Congress are not on board because for various reasons, and they're all different depending on, Karen was a liaison to a member of Congress who had very definite ideas about how and the money should be spent, or how to solve emissions problems and get to zero. Marcia, we have a different challenge with Jamie Herrera Butler. So can we talk to that a little?
I'd be interested to hear what those of you who have interacted with members of Congress on this, what are you hearing?
I'm happy to share experiences. Oregon 1, Suzanne Bonamici, so progressive Democrat. So I think, and a representative there who's very active in the progressive Democratic movement, and that organ, the kind of their caucus and everything else, is a straight dividend to everybody is very, very, is a non-starter. Because of the idea like, okay, Bill Gates is going to get the same dividend as I do, kind of a thing. So the perceived, a few things, key ones, perceived sense of inequity, and not that, I'll say this oversimplistically, these are my views, these are not necessarily the views of the people that I heard from, but that social justice and climate justice sometimes can sound to me from progressive Democrats like that's more important than reducing emissions. It's more important that we address and achieve better social equity in climate work than that we reduce emissions. That's the way it feels, that sometimes the progressive feels to me. I'm not saying that's accurate, but that's how it can feel. And so the point of any kind of a carbon tax or a dividend maybe isn't so much just to reduce emissions, but is to address longstanding environmental inequities and social injustice and social inequities as well. And so the idea that there's a flat dividend that goes to all people equivalent is totally a non-starter. And that the more favored is that some of the, or maybe some portion, maybe a significant portion of revenue that's raised or brought in should go to very specific programs, and those specific programs should be for marginalized communities. And as you all know, that ranges from all the money should go into programs that the government runs to some portion, the various bills that are out there. So there's that piece of it that just makes like CCL's proposal total non-starter for some in the progressive movement. And then you can just get into all kinds of things under the weeds. In terms of historically, progressives favoring more things like things should be done through the EPA, or things should be done through agencies, and things should be done through those type of policies, is an underpinning too, and this diverts or diverges from that, or feels like it diverges from that, versus raise the money and give the EPA or whoever it is the authority to manage what happens with it. My perceptions.
Yeah. I think that's my perception too. Marcia?
A couple things. One I learned in the book was that Bill Gates and all of his companions in wealth don't need to sign up for this. They would have that option of saying, I don't need this dividend. So how many of them will be of that mind is a good question mark. And then secondly, about progressives being against the CCL version of the bill, I think perceptions changed a lot when Pramila Jayapal became a co-sponsor of this bill. As the head of the Progressive Caucus, I think a lot of her members must be now rethinking. I'm hoping the fact that she is now behind that kind of helped.
Yeah.
So just two comments from my limited knowledge of things. And then I wanted to mention in JHB's case, Representative Jamie Herrera Butler's case, for her, the remark that we heard over and over and over for years was, well, once a tax goes in, it never goes away. And she said, you can call it a fee all you want, but a fee is a tax. And as a conservative, I am against taxes. And especially I'm against knowing that once it's in place, it will be there forever and ever. And I can't do that. So for years, we were beating our heads against the wall, asking her to accept this Carbon Fee and Dividend Act, which would never happen. And I'm so grateful in the last year and a half that CCL has pushed more towards the secondary asks. And we have had much more success with that. So she won't go for the big thing, a carbon fee and dividend, but she will do these things that nibble around the edges. She's all for sequestration. She's all for the Growing Climate Solutions Act, two others that we requested, whose names are escaping my
Use It
brain
Act
right
and the
now.
BEST Act.
Thank you. The Use It Act and the BEST Act for battery and so on and so on. So I'm so glad that CCL gave us the encouragement to get away from the one ask, which we knew she could never get to, and then get these secondary things, because that's as good as we're going to get from our 3rd district representative.
I do find it ironic that Jamie politically feels more comfortable co-signing bills that are essentially subsidies or essentially money for for research and development, which I definitely think that that's fine, but it increases the debt. So which conservatives say that apparently our debt, our national debt, is no longer a problem. It's a problem for me, but it doesn't seem to be a problem for either party right now.
I like your point, Sharon, and I think one of the key things is how I've often thought about it is, as a congressperson, your job is to bring money to your district. So wherever you are on the political spectrum, it's a lot easier to vote for spending money on something that might bring research dollars to Washington State University in my district, or the Hatfield, Marine Center in Oregon. And so across the whole spectrum, it's always easier to get them to be supportive of something that spends money that might come to their district, which becomes a problem with something like the fee and dividend, because how do you say, like, awesome, yes, I did bring money into my district, but I think we've had struggled to make the case of a straight dividend. Even if you can calculate the whole thing, it's going to individuals in your district. But then I know, at least in the progressive side, and I do hope that's changing more, it feels like it's maybe not coming in a way that feels fair and equitable, because if you want to help certain people in your district more than others. But it's like, okay, we will spend money on anything, especially research. That's easy. But to stop something is, and to take money in a sense away from your district is a very hard thing to do.
Mm-hmm. And based on campaign season in 2020, carbon tax was, that was nasty. The campaign, negative campaign ads, that became a just nasty.
Go ahead,
Claire?
Rose, please.
Oh, Rose?
Rose was about to say something there. Yeah, please.
I just wanted to share my thought quickly on some of what we've been talking about. It does appear that people who would like to do one thing or the other with the revenue from this policy, they tend to not want to do dividends sometimes because they have a preferred use for that money. And it just occurred to me, maybe we have a universal dividend, and when you go to sign up for your dividend, there's an easy checkbox like, I would like my money to go to tax cuts or to renewables subsidies or another program, or I would like my check in the mail. Maybe that would make more people happy.
Okay. Thanks.
Claire. I can see hands up, Frank.
Yeah, okay, well, yeah. And I was thinking you could also have a checkbox, put mine on the national debt. But now I've forgotten what I was going to. Oh, yes, in the CCL bill, is there anything about if we reach our goals and carbon emissions are falling and falling, is there any decrease in the fee? No idea. I never thought about it.
It's my understanding that the fee kind of stays where it's at, but what ends up happening is in theory, as less and less fossil fuel is pumped out of the ground, and we're, then there's less revenue that is brought in, and slowly your little check every month starts to, go away in theory. Anyone else on Claire's question?
Of course, at the same time, the amount that you're spending on increased fuel costs also is decreasing.
Right, because you're now using some, because
everybody's transitioning.
Other energy, your new energy is cheaper than the old energy.
And cleaner.
And cleaner.
And that
and
may
you can
only
see
be,
Mount Hood.
And those may be only though the people who can afford to make those changes. Hopefully it would be everyone, but I think we might have some inequality there at some point.
Mike, you have a question?
Yeah, I was curious. We've talked about, and I want to say I really appreciate this discussion and the panelists' contributions here. This is really helpful, I think, and really interesting, and it brings up all kinds of questions. We've talked about kind of modeling that's been done on the expected levels of dividend versus the expected rise in the price of gasoline and other things that are carbon intensive, and I'm wondering if that kind of modeling has attempted to look at some of the kinds of price shocks that we are seeing right now and possibly coming over time, depending upon what happens with this war and so on. And also as climate chaos increases somewhat, what kinds of changes are there. Of course, this is really difficult to model. It's political far more than other things. But I think that it seems to me we're seeing right now that gasoline prices have really strong political consequences, and so just energy prices in general. And so, any comments on that?
All.
Yeah, I think that the volatility of fossil fuel prices is important, and the visceral reaction of the public to fossil fuel prices, especially gasoline, which, as I was trying to imply before, goes against all reason, but is certainly politically very, very true, do create an opportunity. I was thinking about this the other day, just the number of mentions of a windfall profit tax that we're seeing. So a windfall profit tax is a special excise tax, like a fee, and it would be put on fossil fuel companies to capture the extra profit they are getting from the increase in price. If you want to really calculate it, you look back and see what did it cost them to produce this product, and you subtract that from the extra profit that they're making because the price went up while they were bringing the product to market. But what's interesting to think about would be, people who argue for a windfall profit tax are often saying, well, the fossil fuels companies are gouging us, they're greedy, and they're responsible for the price increase. The problem is, of course, as we learned in the 70s, a windfall profit tax is immediately passed on to consumers. So it becomes an increase in price. But the question that's interesting is, what do you do with the revenue from a windfall profits tax? And if political leadership were to say, we are going to impose this tax, we know it's going to get passed on to consumers, and therefore we're going to give it to the American public as a dividend, right? Only just temporarily, because this is because of the war in Ukraine and because of the sanctions on Russia. But it essentially gives an opportunity to teach how fee and dividend works, and to make the political argument that this is how you make consumers whole in the face of, the need to artificially create revenue. Because that's really what fee and dividend, what climate change is here. We need to do something that is going to artificially create revenue. And that's what we call rent. And then the question is, who gets the rent? But I like Mike raising the current short-term environment because it's got everybody's attention, and you could tax it, and you could make that tax revenue into a dividend.
So Rose, do you have your hand up to respond to Mike's question?
I do. So I would like to tack on in response to the question about high gas prices that, we are really in a pivotal moment right now in terms of renewable alternative technologies and EVs. These technologies that were far from cost effective in the past are just on the cusp of being the economic option at this moment. And I think now, as gasoline prices are increasing, we're going to start to see a little bit of a different effect where that EV starts to look like the better option, and those renewables continue to look really good.
Cool.
Yeah, I've heard that people are starting to carpool more than they have in the past here recently.
All right, so it's 11:10, so we'll take a couple more questions. Our goal is to end our meeting today at 11:30. So for another 5 minutes, Jim, you have a question?
Well, it's not so much a question as a comment. Can you hear me okay? I'm always worried about my bandwidth.
Yep,
You're
we
good.
can hear you.
So I've been looking at the last month since the Ukrainian war broke out. And the IPCC came out with some pretty harrowing news about the climate, and we need to do stuff quick or we'll reach a tipping point. And it was really overshadowed by the conflict in Ukraine. And then the gas prices, all energy prices took off. And I don't have a lot of confidence with the major energy producers that we're really getting the truth and that they're not in the realm of windfall profits. I mean, how do we ascertain just what the true cost of a barrel of oil is that's on a ship going across the Atlantic or the Pacific from the price that thing was pulled out of the ground versus when it gets to the refinery. I just find that frustrating. And then Paul, you mentioned windfall profits. I just heard on the news last night that California, which has got the highest energy costs of the country, was thinking about trying to come up with a $400 gasoline-oriented rebate for its citizens to make up for those high costs. I listened to Robert Rausch, the ex-Secretary of Labor, and he keeps talking about inflation. And inflation is, in his opinion, is really due to a loss of different producers, like for toilet paper or paper goods. Basically, you got Kimberly-Clark and one other producer, Johnson & Johnson. And I think that's true with the oil situation. There aren't that many producers and they can rig the price, and they are rigging the price high. So I know that wasn't a question. It was more just a rambling string of comments.
Can I just make a 1 minute response to that? Or maybe I can do it in 30 seconds. Yeah, capitalism is really frustrating. The key, I think, point to remember is price is not related to cost, right? Price is related to supply and demand. In other words, what the market will bear. And so there's only two ways to really bring prices down. And that is to increase supply. So obviously the fossil fuel industry is jumping on this war as an argument for pipelines and leases and everything else, or to bring down demand. So bringing down demand is how you bring down prices if you don't want to increase supply. And we think the price of gasoline is so significant in our lives. It's a pretty cheap liquid. If you compare it to milk or coffee, it's pretty cheap. The problem is we drink a glass of milk a day, and maybe we use a gallon of gasoline a day. And a gallon is a lot more than a glass. If we could get it down to the point where we used a glass of gasoline a day, the price would come down, and we would also be addressing the most significant social, political, and ecological issue of our time, climate change. So all of this stuff about the war is either an argument for increasing production or for reducing demand. And it has nothing to do with the cost of producing fossil fuels.
Well, I'm not sure there's been a real increase in demand.
Oh,
The
there has
lines
been
at the gas
tremendous-
station has gotten really, 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 really long, but I don't know where people are driving.
Sorry, if we run the numbers, there's been tremendous increase in demand for energy.
It's COVID cabin fever. I'm guilty. Marcia? So we're at 11:15, so we need to start wrapping up. We have two more questions. Marcia and Mike, can you keep it short?
Yeah, actually, this isn't my question. My husband has been sitting across the table from me, and he wants to say
Michelle.
something. So here he goes.
Hi. Yeah, I try to make it short. One thing is about the fee and dividend. I understand the reasoning about social justice versus dividend being going to everybody. There are probably ways around that, like means testing or something. But I think tax or increase in price without some kind of compensation for the people who consume, who have no choice, is political suicide. Because of my origins, we watch the French news every night, and they show news from across Europe. And even before the war in Ukraine, the cost of energy had been increasing a lot, as you said, COVID cabin fever, something like that. And the response of the government has been, we're gonna give rebates to everybody who at the pump. I mean, originally they said we're gonna send a check of €100 to everybody because they're affected by the price of gas and also the price of heating gas and all that. Now everybody says, well, not enough because the price keep going on. So they said, okay, we're going to give a rebate, which means basically cutting the taxes on gasoline at the pump. So everybody who goes and fill up their car, they're going to get a rebate on the cost of gas. So particularly this being an election year in France, everybody on every side is saying we need to lower the pain level by making it cheaper for people to heat their home and to fill their car. So I think any kind of tax without a return to the consumer is political suicide. And so now there are ways to use maybe some of the money for things that will decrease demand. For example, in France, again, there are subsidies for high mileage cars, subsidies for electric vehicles, subsidies for insulating your home so that you reduce your energy need. And that could be done. The downside politically is that means going through a government program, which means it's controlled by the government. It includes an overhead to manage it and so on and so forth. But yeah, the main point I wanted to make is increasing the cost of gas without some kind of compensation, at least for the people who are absolutely dependent on it, is just suicide.
Mhm. Pro for dividends.
Yeah. Got that, check that box right there. Yeah.
Frank, we've got one more person. Mike Ellison, you have a comment as we wrap things up?
Yeah, very briefly, when Paul responded to my question a few moments ago, he mentioned the idea of possibly, a dividend now to deal with the price shocks people are getting for gasoline. And there is such a bill that has actually been introduced. It's called the Big Oil Windfall Profits Act, and it was introduced by Ro Khanna and Sheldon Whitehouse. So both the House and Senate, and of course they're progressives, but it does, levy a tax on the large oil companies. And one of the things it includes is a means-tested quarterly rebate for consumers. Anyway, so there is something out there where the trial of the dividend might happen.
All
Thanks,
right.
Mike.
So Frank, it's time to wrap things up.
Well, we just want to really thank Rose, Lisa, and Paul for taking the time to meet with us today. I think we all learned a lot, I believe. And yes, so appreciate your time, appreciate your input. It was very, very well thought out and very clear. And I think a lot of us came away learning and understanding these topics a lot more than we did an hour and a half ago. So thank you. And I think we'll turn it over to Marcia to carry on with the rest of the meeting.
Okay, well, we will wrap everything up in 10 minutes. So at 11:30,